Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sarkar, and our guest today is an internationally acclaimed poet, editor, translator, artist and curator, Sudeep Sen. He is also recognized as one of the major new generation voices in the world literature. In today's session, we would aim to explain art from Sudeep Sen's perspective, covering the performances, preparations, attitude, personality, and sensitivity of the poet, as well as the structure, binding, liberation of poetry. Welcome to TYMS Academy, Sudipta.
Thank you very much. Looking forward.
To be very honest, two things I have never been in my life are speechless and nervous, and I still haven't been able to get over the former, but the second one I think is very operational at this moment. For our viewers, I met Sudipta for the first time in Kolkata in 2017, I think APJ Literary Festival, when that time I was doing my research on contemporary Indian English poetry. And whenever we talk about poetry, especially contemporary Indian English poetry, I think we surely cannot give a miss to Sudipta's contribution to literature and this whole poetic canvas. Sudipta, during my research, more than anything else, I was, impressed by your cosmopolitan outlook, which, can also adapt the impulses of traditions and poetic forms. And most interestingly, the way, you celebrate possibilities of hybridity by extending the scale and scope of poetry beyond text. And surely your poetry has touched millions of hearts across the world. And I cannot wait to start this conversation with you. But before that, I want to say that it's truly an honor.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you.
So to begin with, Sarita, your poetry aura consists of more than 30 collections of poetry. Some of your award-winning books include Postmarked India, New and Selected Poems, Distracted Geographies, Rain, Fractals, Arya, which has also won the A.K. Ramanujan Translation Award. You have also edited several important anthologies, including the HarperCollins books of English poetry, World English Poetry, and Modern English Poetry by younger Indian poets. Your works have also, appeared in leading international and national newspapers, journals, magazines. It has been broadcasted in, radios, television. I want to know, how do you organize your writing life?
That was a very, very long introduction. I thought you were talking about someone else. But thank you. Writing life, especially when you're a poet and an artist, you have to be very, very disciplined in a very kind of interior kind of way. The exteriority of my life, my freelance life can, make other people jealous because it is not a 9-to-5 situation. However, look at me. Here it's 8:30 at night and I'm working. I have to be sensible and bright and answer all your questions. So in a sense, when you're a writer and an artist, it doesn't make for a very good family life because you can be inspired at 2 at night, and if it's winter and you're under the quilt and you want to go to another room and write down what you've jotted down, because invariably if you don't, next morning you think that you'll have the thought, but it's flown away, and once it's flown away, the poem is gone. So it's not very pleasant for your partner to sort of, you're constantly leaving at odd hours of the day. It's also very, very mood dependent art. But having done it for so long, there is a sort of schedule I follow. I would spend 2 hours with poetry every day. That's my puja, my riyaz. Now the thing is, of course I can't write a new poem every day. I would be very, very, very happy if I could do that, but that's not realistic. So if I'm not inspired, I would read another book of poems. I often review, write on poetry. So all those other things that happen around poetry happens in those 2 hours. Often it is just simply reading other people's work. you got to keep yourself well oiled when you're sort of writing. And many of the younger poets I find are very, very excited about poetry, but their own poetry, and that's it. And maybe one or two of their friends. And when you have tried to have a conversation, they've not really read enough. I mean, okay, they might have read, the Radiant Reader or whatever set text they had in school and college, but beyond that, it's alarming how little they've read. But they're super excited about poetry. So at one level, you don't know what to do with it because you want to support that sort of stuff. But at the same time, you need a sort of larger critical engagement. So yeah, so you stay with poetry in one way or the other. I try and do that. You see, a lot of my writer friends happen to be novelists, and I find most novelists have a proper sort of timetable. They get up in the morning, make their coffee, sit down at the desk. Some even properly change and shave as if they're going to office, and sit down and bash out however many words they do. Afternoon, it's like going to the office. So I find that quite charming, actually, that people can do that. So, of course, you can't write poetry that way, but you have to sit at your desk and fidget. White space and fidgeting is also very, very important. Constantly being engrossed in other people's work or your own work is not very healthy. You need a lot of empty space for the words and the thoughts to rebound and resound in your cranium, so to speak. And even on the text, in a poetry book, you'll see all my poetry books, there's a lot of form and the way words are placed on the page. I'm very, very careful about that because for the inked part of the page to breathe, you need the white to interact. Similarly, even in your brain, you need the emptiness, the stillness, the space for that, for you to think and create, so that the cranium can be properly, managed. Think of a very pedestrian example, a dishwasher or a washing machine. You never fill it to the brim. You're supposed to fill it only 70 to 80%. Why? Because the clothes need to tumble and have space for it to interact with the soap suds and molecules, so that then they can release the dirt. So that's the same idea.
So Sudeep, as you have mentioned about this white space thing, I would really like to say that, yeah, true, that today one of the most interesting aspects of contemporary Indian English poetry is the fusions of styles, the idea of shaping the space on the page and by using various space affecting elements. Some of you have already mentioned, the colors, the way we are using spaces in different ways, or the lines, the interlinguistic puns as well. And if I go back to fractals or some of your poetry collections, I think I can visualize those space. Like when I read your poem Mount Vesuvius in 8 frames, we can actually visualize a dovetail-like, joint-like structure. Similarly, your poem Lily Pads, they also have, those musical notes or mathematical symbols, linguistic puns. Similar goes with single malt. So, do you think that poetry and architecture share a paradoxical sense of room in a way?
I would actually just replace the word paradoxical with parallel. For me, there have been parallel tracks. Had I not become a poet, I would have been an architect. But of course, I always choose the most common things. I mean, I'm not practical. I've never been very, very practical. I was a science student. Physics and fiber optics were some of my favorite subjects. So a lot of science comes into the poetry, as you can see. And architecture was very, very close. I sat for the architecture school, got in, and then pursued English Lit. So all these elements come into my poetry. So the structure and the shape and the sort of, you were talking about Mount Vesuvius and the way the ends of the poems, if you join them, they dovetail together. Or say Bharatanatyam dancer, the poem uses a particular rhyme scheme, which essentially is reflective of the rag, the tal and the bol. Ta dhin ta tai thai ta, ta dhin ta tai thai. ABACCA, ABACCA is the rhyme scheme. Now, initially when I wrote the poem, I didn't think of the structure. But as I revised the poem, as it evolved, I said, there's such a wonderful, strong rhythm to the dance I'm watching, that why can't I replicate that for my own sake? It's, you just have to have fun. A lot of writing is pleasurable. People think, if you lose the pleasure out of any art, then things can become rather humdrum. So I said, why not replicate that Indian rag, tal, bol into the English poetic form? And this rhyme scheme hasn't been done before. So you invent a new rhyme scheme. So these are things that, this happens. But you have to be quite obsessive about not just poetry, but the way things work, shapes, colors, temperature change, mood swings, people, life. You have to be open. You have to be intelligently vulnerable. People have become too cool. The more cool you become, the less interesting your art can become. Not always, but can.
So now, Sudhita, when you're talking about not being, not following those kind of trends, or not, concluding yourself in certain kind of streams, or not being practical and all, but do you think that, while writing poems, do you consciously think of an impact of those writings on the viewer's thought process, or it's only, a self-expression up to the point, that it is accepted by the readers or received by the readers well, without any kind of controversy and all that?
So, when I was younger, it was largely about, writing for myself. But of course, if you're pursuing it seriously, there is that sort of urge to publish, and you want that to be out there, and you want readership, and you want people to like your work. All those things are there. So for me, if it's purely for my own consumption, that's all right. But if I know that there's a poem that I've written and I want to get it out into the public sphere, in the public domain, then the onus is on me to work really hard and to make it as good and as lean and as tight as it's possible, so that it's not fair on the reader to read something that is unformed, which you see on social media all the time. People are sad, they write 2 lines and it's on Facebook within 5 minutes, and then next thing you know, there are 5 likes, and then there's a 6th like from Uzbekistan, and all their friends are saying you're internationally famous. I mean, that's how bad it is. I mean, the amount of mediocre, bad poetry that is there on the internet, or on Facebook and Instagram and so on, is astounding. And what worries me is these are people, some of them are fairly serious writers, and aren't they thinking what other people will think? Or are they so deluded about the fact that anything they write is sort of they're vomiting gems? So, I mean, writing is hard work. Being inspired is the easy part, because that strikes you as as a flash of lightning. But also, there are the other kinds of writing where I'm asked, for instance, I'm commissioned to write a poem on a particular topic. So then you have to sort of almost do it like an actor. You go into the method acting situation, you imagine the character, you imagine the space, you read around it, and then you have to sort of will yourself into a space where you're actually completely immersed in that kind of topic, for instance, and then try and be spontaneous. So people only see the glamorous end of it, lit fest, when you're reading, you're signing books, and the books are published, and all that. All that is wonderful and fun, but that's only 2% of my life. Most of it is completely like the life I lead right now. Most people talk about quarantine and isolation. For me, it's normal. All my life I've been in quarantine and isolation, because that's the way I work. I'm with myself on my own, shut to the rest of the world until I choose to go out.
So, I mean, this going out, or this, meeting this glamorous world. Again, when you're talking about this Insta poet, FB poets, we have, a lot of them. And nowadays, we are also having this online poetry sessions where, just poets and just normal people from anywhere, they just join together. And with this self-publishing.
Normal people. I consider myself as a normal person.
No, not normal in that sense. I meant not poets in that way. So with the people are also self-publishing their books and all. But somehow, don't you think that books ultimately appear in the world as artifacts and as solid realities, and also sometimes as settled facts? So, isn't it more accurate to say that a book should be a process rather than a thing?
rather than
Just because we think, I mean, just because we have to publish, we have to be in this honor, so we have to do this. So,
See,
do
I
you
don't know
think
how to
it
answer
goes
that question
like
because
that?
I've never fallen into that trap. I mean, publishing a book was never the end all for me. Writing and experiencing the process of writing, or the process of art, the process of learning, process of thinking, process of creating is what actually thrills me. Um, if it gets published, wonderful. If it doesn't, I'm not going to be unhappy about it. I'll continue writing, I'll write a new one. And as and when I have enough decent work for a manuscript, then I will look at it to see if the book can come out. But if you think of a book first and you have to fill up all that space, then you're in real trouble. It's a different way of looking at things. So you know, for me, poetry is something that I cannot do without. It's like breathing.
So,
Um, and that's my ventilator, to use the current sort of new phrases. So without that, I'm not able to survive in many ways, artistically and otherwise. So whether or not the ventilator gets packed up and in a beautiful place and gets sold is irrelevant completely. That's not what now starts.
no, no, but like when you talk about poetry and when you say that it's like breathing and it's a continuous process, and you don't dilute yourself in another way. But we see that some of the best international anthologies, poetry anthologies, and all, they give you a theme to write. Then how do you think that these two things goes parallelly? I mean, in one way you are saying that it comes from your heart. You simply cannot sit and write based on particular theme. And again, some of the best. What about the budding poets who are trying to come out, who are actually
Yeah,
writing well, but they have
I'll
to
answer your
settle?
question about thematic
Hmm.
books. As I said, there are times you're commissioned to write on a particular subject, and I describe to you how you do it. Right now, if you're engaged politically and otherwise, you cannot possibly not think about the pandemic. And to me, I've been thinking about the whole issue of climate change, Anthropocene, for the long time. So for me, the pandemic is a subset of what's actually happening in the larger space. So now, because this is a fashionable topic, when people ask me to contribute something on the pandemic, it's not difficult because I've written some things, or I'm thinking of a particular aspect of the pandemic or the Anthropocene that I want to explore, and I will explore. And if the poem is good enough, I will send it. So it's not difficult. Also, when someone is doing a book on love poetry, for God's sakes, we've all written some poems in the past. So you cull out from where you've done it. But to forcibly write for a project, it is possible to do if you're skilled. But more often than not, you fall fairly flat on your face because it does take time. It's not about just the writing, Queen. It's you write and you edit, and the first 3 4 drafts you do when you've just written. Then I let the poem stay for a while. I go away from it because I'm too close to the text. I have a set of readers who will read it and they'll probably slash it to bits. I trust them really a lot because they are completely honest. Some of these people might say this it doesn't even deserve to be a tonga for some hot samosas. So then you just take it and say, okay, this needs to go, and then you come back. So a process of actually building a poem is much like building a house or making a painting. It takes time. So that's the thing about insta poets. I mean, I see it, I don't get it. Very rarely do I find something that is appealing. I mean, how can you have instant coffee, Nescafe coffee for poetry, for God's sakes? Please. I don't want to go down that line. I have no problem. I'm very, very democratic. I'm supportive of a lot of poetry. I've done many anthologies, and I like to give young poets a chance. but they have to go through the basic gate of rigor. Without rigor, it ain't happening.
Sure. So, since we are talking about writing process and also about writing poetry and all, so as a student of literature, we often see poetry in three different phases: the assimilative one, the imitative one, and also the experimental one. And in one of your
You're talking
recent
about Indian
interviews,
poetry in English?
yes, Indian poetry in English.
Yeah.
So,
The history of the
the
history of
history of Indian English poetry, as we define it as pre-independence, post-independence, and again we have segregated it into three phases: the imitative, the assimilative, and the experimental. So, experimental basically falls here when we are talking about the Insta poems as well. So, like, yeah, in one of your interviews, you said that you were born in colonial India, grew old in free India, and shall die in socialist India. So, what do you
that
think
is my
have
dream.
been?
I don't see any socialism happening with the current situation.
I'm just
At
quoting,
the moment,
what have you said?
it's pure fascism. So yeah, that's just a distant
So,
dream.
so what according to you have been a decisive shift in English writing in India? Since you have already,
The turn is still happening. I think we have now a good critical mass of very good English language poets in India who are just as good compared to any other international poet. It's happened now, but it takes a long time. As you said, I mean, you've studied this academically. I'm just a practitioner, so you guys know the intricacies better. But the first generation, obviously, they were imitative, and then the second generation, they were trying to grapple with the language, which is English. It's only the current generation that for them English is almost like a mother tongue. But I have to say, there's a caveat. A lot of young people speak very confident English, but full of grammatical errors. You just have to switch on a television set or an interviewer. They speak so fluently, but it's all over the place. Now, when you question that, they said, "Oh, this is Indian English." I'm sorry. English is English. There's only one set of rules for grammar. Indian English has beautiful tonality of an Indian accent. That's wonderful. But it cannot be wrong English. I mean, there's only one way you can write a sentence. So, I don't know whether it's experimental or not. I mean, Insta Poet, for instance, let's not talk about Insta Poet for too long because, it's as instant as it gets, it comes and goes. It
so you
doesn't
do
last.
believe that social media has a great role in building a
Of course, I mean,
poet's
I
journal
love
and
social
journey and
media.
all.
I use social media, myself. I any tool, any new tool, any kind of technology should be embraced and used if it can be used. But a certain kind of people live a kind of virtual life now. You go to a restaurant and you see a young couple sitting having dinner or having a drink, but they are actually talking to each other through their screens. How often do you see people looking into each other's eyes or tactility? Those things seem to have disappeared completely. I mean, what's the point? I mean, if I have to speak to someone on the screen, why go out and make the effort to go and have dinner with someone, for instance? But it's all text, 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 and it's fast. It's so fast that, again, there's a whole new kind of spellings and all these emojis and emoticons. What are they? It's just shortcut
Abbreviations.
for writing, that because they don't have the time, but they have the masses of time and it's a tunnel vision, it's an echo chamber. Social media is not reality. Social media is just a good tool in addition to many other things. But I'm sorry to say, a lot of people just live in that space. And if you live in that contained space, which has already been fabricated and the algorithms have been done by various other people, where is your individuality? Nowhere. So if five people say something bad and you get depressed, it's a very sad state of affairs. Or you get happy if five people say something nice. That's not reality at all. There's life to be lived, there's taxes to be paid, there's vegetables to be bought, there's marriages to happen. There you have to go out and fall in love, and you have to have heartbreak. Those are not easy things. They happen outside, in the outside space, in the real life. But if it's only awesome and wow, and it's an
So,
all.
Shurinja, moving from this, Insta and FB poetry thing, I'd come back to fractals. I started talking about fractals where we find the dialogic aspects or a connection between poetry and different forms of art. Now, like if I have fractals with me and somebody says music, I'll directly think about your poem August Rhapsody. Or as I said regarding classical dance, bowls and tals, Bharatanatyam dancer, automatically comes to my mind. Or talking about paintings, in your poem cover drawing inspired by the paintings of Imtiaz Harkar comes to mind. So, can you talk a little bit about the relationship these art forms have in your life through, of course, your recitation?
Yeah, so poetry is just one of the many art forms or genres that exist. And if you're a normal human being with likes and dislikes, you also listen to music, you also read books, you also watch dance performances, you also watch bad Bollywood film, you also watch art films, you have very fine dining and street food. If you can do all of that with a sense of grace and humility, then I feel life is normal. So you are bound to be affected by all the other spaces. So for me, painting, music, and dance are particularly things I personally like. Often when I'm in my study, I have some form of sound always there. Right now, there's my family of frog. It's a little Zen pond, and there's always water trickling there. And there are these baby frogs and fish, and so I go and visit them once in a while, and they make these beautiful organic lapping sounds of the water. Similarly, I might have music on. So what then happens is, and classical dance for me is something that I get really high on. I mean, a good dance performance. If I see a good dance performance, and when I come out of the auditorium, I'm just floating. That is the best high I can ever get. So automatically, that's the space I'm interested in. So this is an area which is called ekphrastic poetry, response to other
Yes.
art. So ekphrastic, of course, specifically talks about painting, but I've extended that into music and dance. Let me read a dance poem for you, actually.
Yes.
My next book is called The Whispering Anklet. And Payal. And I thought for this particular book, I'll also have photographs in it. So initially, I've written on Kalaripattu and Bharatanatyam and Mohiniyattam, all sorts of dance forms. And then I thought, I'll have the poems and I'll have photographs of dancers and so on. And at some point, I realized it was becoming like a catalog. Then I dispensed with that idea and I said, I want photographs of one dancer, but all abstract. So maybe the swish of a sari, or 1/3 of an eyelid, or just 1/10 of her toenail, very macro and very abstract. So I was sitting with two friends of mine, Aditi Mangaldas, who's I think one of our finest contemporary dancers. She's a Kathak dancer, but she does contemporary work. And Dinesh Khanna is a photographer. So I asked her, can you model for me? And she said, yeah, I can model for you, but what if all my senior dancers will kill me because, all my gurus are there. So I said, it doesn't matter, just blame them. It's my book. And it was amazing because I thought it'll be just, I just wanted some photographs. I take photographs, so I went with my camera and Dinesh went with his camera. But she was very particular. She says, no, I want my makeup team. I need to be in this space. And I said, this is getting really complicated. And she was very assertive at that time. So I said, okay, fine. I mean, she's doing it as a friend. And then later I realized why. We shot it in a studio and she got into this whole mood space and she performed so many full parts of different productions. And it was just the crew and me watching her from this close. It was an amazing experience because she said, when you're shooting, you need to be lit in a particular way. So a professional does it in a different way. So this book, of course, now because of the pandemic, it's all written, it's all shot. We need to sit with the designer to do this. But I'll read a poem which is dedicated to her called Kathak.
Yeah.
Kathak. Deep within the eyes of a dancer, irises and poems bloom. On her cupped, curled, coal-line eyelids, similes smile. On each eyelash, metaphors arch, waiting to flutter. On her bosom's electric silk fabric, secret lyrics are bloused. Her limbs' slender extension tips, decant arias, Tumri sing, soar, her balletic grace liquid. She dances on water, always afloat. Even Khusro and Kabir, stunned, tongue-tied, searchingly compete to compose couplets for this dancer's next movement. Pupils wide-eyed, she cajoles, seeking her lover. Hidden in the dancer's heart, the beloved quietly resides.
Beautiful. I could, yeah, it's really wonderful.
So
I could actually visualize the cover image of, Whispering Antlers. I think you have already shared that.
I know. So, so when you read a poem like this, it's almost spiritual. And you have to be in love with that person at the same time. It's this space which is why I said you have to be totally vulnerable. It's not a good way of living because our societies have very strict norms. So I sent it to her husband and she says, oh my God, I wish I wrote the poem. I could have gifted it her for her birthday or something. But that's what it is. It's a beautiful balance between the spiritual and the temporal, between intellectual and passion. I mean, both reside on this sort of razor edge. And when this poem I wrote, this is a very, very edited version. It took a long time because you want each essence to blossom. Fulta যখন ফোটে না ভালো করে, it's the blossoming of it which is magical. Once it's a beautiful flower, everybody will appreciate it. Once it's not formed, people won't appreciate it. But the whole idea of the possibility of blossoming, and you don't know which way it's going to go. So that's the magic. And can you imagine Kabir and Khusro? They are stunned and tongue-tied. Who am I? They were supposed to have written the couplets for her next movement, but they can't because they are completely stunned and stoned looking at her. But
basically, I would say that
it has to be coming from the tissues of your body. Real poetry and real art is that. Can you write a poem like this Insta? No, you can't.
No, we are not again going into Insta poets and FB poets. I'll be, talking about my favorite section, that is Ekphrastic section. And again, as you talked about, spiritual and temporal thing, I want to, go back to your section called that Dreaming of Cézanne, where, you have written poems based on the paintings of post-impressionist painter and French artist Paul Cézanne. And we have seen that Cézanne's painting mostly, it constitutes the most powerful link between the ephemeral and the permanent.
Yeah.
Now, if we talk about, his poem Skull, we find that, there is a allegorical significance of the theme of vanitas there. So, do you also believe in creating a poetics of vanitas? Because we find similar theme of transience and mutability in your other poems as well. Say Jacket on the
This
Chair.
idea of vanitas is interesting because it's not the futility of the situation. It's the possibility. When you keep yourself open to possibilities, life is one beautiful journey because if you are hopeless, there's nothing you can wake up to. life in general can be quite grim around you, because living life, the business of living life, is not easy. You have to correct your students' papers. You have to come on webinars. This is your third today, and you're still glowing and smiling. I don't know how you do it, but it's hard work. So, but if you tell yourself that you are just a foot soldier to a larger cosmic order, and I'm not being spiritual in a kind of wishy-washy way, we are really a dot in the larger manifestation of things, then you know that you can wake up every morning and there's always hope. And if there's hope, you can smile. And if you can smile, life's good, isn't it? So let me read one of these poems, because you described it in a way that if I had to sit for the exam and write an answer to the same question, I wouldn't know what to do, because you said it in such an academic, erudite way. I'm just pulling your leg. But it's good to see another side, which sort of talks in terms of exams and constructs and boundaries and isms. Because unfortunately, a lot of art, good art, is beyond that. It's beyond classification. In any case, you were talking about Jacket on a Chair. This is based on Cézanne's eponymous poem, which is painting, Jacket on a Chair, which is 1890 to 92. And this is a good example of ekphrastic poetry. Jacket on a Chair. You carelessly tossed the jacket on a chair. The assembly of cloth collapsed in slow motion into a heap of cotton, cotton freshly picked from the field, like flesh without a spine. The chair's wooden frame provided a brief skeleton, but it wasn't enough to renew the coat's shape, the body's prior strength, or the muscle to hold its own. When one peels off one's outer skin, it is difficult to hide the true nature of blood. Wood, wool, stitches, and joints, an epitaph of a cards player's shuffle, and the history of my dark faith. When you know the painting, it's almost like making a film of the painting, and you animate the characters in the. You see these little gifs these days on social media, back to social media, where a Van Gogh painting has been animated, so the characters suddenly get up from the chair and start walking. That's the sort of thing you're doing in your head and in the poetry, even though after having written the poem, this is just as frozen as the painting is on the wall, but you've given it a different life, and you're looking at the same thing with different eyes, and you're feeling it. I felt very bad for the jacket because it was being treated so poorly by the card players. I said, how does the jacket feel? What about the cotton? What about the sort of luminosity of the texture of the cloth? And it just is told to assume a particular shape just because it's on the back of a chair or on someone's back. So that got me going.
Now, as you mentioned about card players, I remember, when I was reading that poem, the way you have mentioned about, everything, the very small intricacies of life, like the color of the chair, the jacket, the way, they were holding their hands and all that. It actually felt like, reading fractals, especially this Ekphrastic section, the blue note section was like, entering into artfully curated museums where we have, things from all the genres, from all the places, from all the centuries. But now I think we'll be moving to your translation part.
Except that the wonderful thing is it's my museum. I've created the museum.
Yes.
It's for myself. And the others can enter it, because I don't want an art critic to tell me what to see. I want to see and feel and then tell other people, walk through my museum of words and music and art. So even Blue Nude, the poems, which are response to Cézanne's Blue Nude series, What I was actually also trying to do is play with the whole Radha and Krishna folklore, the blue god. So to me, when I'm also looking at Western art, my filters are very, very Bengali. That's the space I've grown up in. That is the first layer of support and rootedness. You have we talk about home and the world later and rooms and how you inhabit rooms. But the first room you inhabit is your mother's womb. And then the second room you inhabit is your mother's lap and your father's lap and whoever wishes to carry you, and the room you're placed in. And so the rooms that you are given are predefined. It has very specific rectangular shapes. But with art, you can create impossible rooms, rooms which don't have which don't have roofs, rooms which have got walls that are crooked, stairway to heaven, for instance. Possible? Yes, it is. You can have you can design staircases which are completely unusable but beautiful to look at. Imagine a staircase which is like a helix or a parabola. It'll get you nowhere, you'll get stuck eventually. But just the idea of the parabolic staircase and frame is so beautiful. So it's this kind of art space is reinventing what is already there through another set of filter, through another artist, so that it becomes anew. Because good art can be interpreted in many ways. I think that character from the frame is, her hand is reaching out to me and said, hold me. But the description I read is so formal and staccato that I don't know where the critic was. I don't have anything against critics and academics, of course. I love to take the piss out of them because, I go to these academic conferences and they're so holier and thou, and they speak in such convoluted language with so much jargon. And God forbid if I've read that book, I said, they're not talking about, they've got nothing at all to do with the book. For instance.
No, but then I remember that when I was going to meet you in for this APJ Literary Festival, I was literally nervous because
you came very
because people have this notion that poetry. What do you do research and what kind of research do you do in poetry? But then there's a lot of things. You are talking about this free flow of emotions and all, but back then we have so many things to talk about. There are some logical reasoning. We have methodologies to do. So the prospect of meeting you and basically talking to you face to face regarding poetry at that time was actually making me nervous, and even today I think there is no change.
I remember.
So, Sudeep, that now, let's move on to your translation part. Now, you have translated poets from across the world, and even your works have been translated in more than 25 languages. What is your idea of translating poems or poets?
Very simple, actually. For me, I translate because it's a labor of love. If I like a piece of text, especially poetry, I want that poem to travel into other languages which other people don't know because I've derived so much pleasure from it. And when I see bad translation, your body shrinks in agony, especially when they're done by non-poets. Because Jivanananda Das's Bonalata Sen, it's the most translated poem on earth. After the Bible, that's the most translated piece of text. So I'm here. It could be apocryphal, the whole thing. But it doesn't matter. It's a good story. Now, all the translations I've read of Bonalata Sen, 90% of them, the content is correct. The story is told. But where's the poetry? I hear it in Bangla and I get goosebumps. But when I read the English, I said, where is the poetry? So then I took it upon myself to do it. Now, how do you do that? My process is very scientific. It's got lots of methodologies. You like that word. Because I was a science student and I like music, I do it through my ear. So I first read it out in Bangla, or have two sets of people read it out in Bangla, a woman's voice and a man's voice. I take down all the notation of each line. So once I hear it many times, I have a grid in front of me with only the notations. It's like a music score sheet. There are no words there, but I've got the soundtrack of the poem embedded. After I've got this Bangla soundtrack embedded, and it could be Urdu, it could be Hindi, depending on the poet, then I start translating the phrases and words to fit that cadence. Because without that rhythm and cadence, where's the rush? Where's the juice? Where's the musicality? And if the poetry doesn't have musicality, it's flat as old bread. I mean, imagine making chapatis and goram goram when it's just fluffed up on the oven and it tosses on your plate and you eat it. The pleasure of that over reheating an old chapati. So that was what got me going. So that's very simple for me. I just want someone else to enjoy it. Let me read the poem itself. Everybody knows the Bangla. I won't read the Bangla, but I'll just read the English translation. So Banolata Sen by Jibanananda Das. For 1,000 years, I've walked this earth's passage by day and night. From Lanka's shores to Moloy's vast seas, I've traveled much, been a guest at Bimbishar and at Ashok's courts, stayed in the distant nights in the town of Vidarbha. I'm long worn out. Around me, waters of sea and life have endlessly swelled. My only peace, a fleeting moment snatched with her, Natorer Bonolata Sen. Chultar, Kobekar, Andhokar, Bidishar, Nisha, like the dense ink night of Bidisha, her hair black, deep black, her face like the delicate weave of Shrabosti's filigree frieze. Just as a lost boatman, rudderless, tossing in the far seas, chances upon a lush green isle of spice, I too caught a sight, saw her, a mere glimpse in the dark. Gently raising her eyes like a bird's nest, she whispered, "Where were you all this while?" And there she stands at my dream's end, my own Bonolata Sen. With soft settling hiss of dew, evening closes the day's end. Kites erase from their wings sun-stained smell of flight. When colors of the earth gently fade, fireflies light up their palette, and old songs find new lyric, old stories new score. Birds return home, so do the rivers, as life's trade its give and take ceases. Only the dark stays, and just as it remains, so does, sitting by my side, face to face, my own Bonolata Sen.
Lovely. And it's not this only this.
It maps the Bangla original, the cadence. It was hard work, obsession.
True.
But Bangla did it to me. It infected me forever. I was happy.
I also loved your the translation of Ek Bosa. As I said, there are so many, versions of Ek Bosa, but the way, I just love the way you have translated Ek Bosa. Even Tagore's Khapchara poems. I mean, we rarely find, those poems.
Tagore's Khapchara poem was actually a fun project. I mean, I started it with my father. Tagore, Bengalis. I mean, what do we say about this clan? I grew up in Delhi, in Chittaranjan Park, in a Bengali household. So I was surrounded by too much Tagore. So as a youngster, I had an aversion to Tagore because it was coming out of every orifice. And I said, this is not the man I want to actually worship. I preferred Qazi Nazrul Islam or Jivananda Das, much more. It's only as an adult, as a mature reader, that I actually got more interested in Tagore and saw the nuances of Tagore. But I realized there was one book that hadn't been translated in English, which was Khapchara. So my father and I sort of started translating it. And we were having a lot of fun. Unfortunately, he died. So, I mean, I sort of, the project is still not finished. But that was hard because that has very, it's nonsense verse in a sense. Khap chhada, out of sync. So to get the rhymes into Bangla was incredibly difficult because you lose the sense of humor if you do it in English. But anyway, I gave it a go. So it was good fun. That's the thing. You just have to enjoy whatever you do.
Yes.
When you
have a smile on your face when you read those poems.
Smile, you have to cry too. You have to bleed. Bleeding is just as important as smiling. You have to be there. You have to be present. You have to immerse yourself completely. That is what is missing most of the time, I think. Which is why any piece of art or poetry doesn't rise beyond just the page. Because I can see from your expressions that you're having a visceral response to the poem when I'm reading. That's the whole point, isn't it? It should just
true that.
All this sort of
takes a different one. Yes, you feel it actually. So, with like when you're talking about translation and good translation, bad translation, the need of translation, and this Insta poet, every poet. Recently, Vishal Dadlani, the music composer, he tweeted that remixes are scavenging of the word's kind that allows the exploitation of what should be a composer's legacy without any regards for the original composers themselves. So, do you think that this happens in poetry translation as well, especially again with the upsurge of poetry's popularity, these Insta, FB, and self-publishing houses? Do you think that the way music industry is somehow ruining the original classic pieces by creating a remix of that? Bad translation or translation without Asians does the same thing.
I don't have such a hard stand on it purely because I think sometimes I've heard remixes which are fabulous, Sometimes they're even better than the original. But the thing is, you need to know the original. A lot of people, haven't heard the original, so they listen to a remix and think that this is really great, But what happened to the way the song actually sounded like first?
Have you heard Ganda Food Bottle Look Beauty?
Yeah.
The remix of that. Yeah. What do you want to say about that? Is it a good remix?
Who the band is, but there's this women's band in Kolkata which does Rabindra Sangeet in rock. I think they are fabulous because what they've done is very interesting. They haven't destroyed the text of the song. They sing the entire song, but it's a rock song with bass guitar, and the way they pronounce the word is in tune with the genre they're doing it. Now that is exciting in a sense, if you can do it well. But the problem is more often than not, it's done poorly because it's imitative and it's very aspirational and it's very wannabe. Wannabe.
So, wannabe, yeah. So, what would you say is the most significant aspect one must pay attention to while translating poems? As a translator,
be honest, what do you think? Be truthful to the original text. I think for me as a translator, I'm just a foot soldier. The poem and the original poet is always going to be the more important part. But if your ego comes in and if you as a translator want to show off how well you've done it, then I think there's a problem. You have to do the translation really well, but it has to be invisible. The translator shouldn't be present when you're reading it in another language. And that takes a lot of work. But that means immersing yourself in that particular space, that history, and so on, and then getting it right.
That emotion is very important.
Of course, emotion and the language. There are two sides to the same thing. Only language will make it only very cerebral. Only emotion will make it syrupy and soppy and terrible. But it's
so you have to create a balance between.
It's the right mix. It's the right mix. Think of a a sound studio where the sound engineer is the mixing board with all those million buttons in front of the mixer. It's one basic sound, but the calibration you can do when you're mixing is where the art is, ultimately. It's the balance. So if you want a certain kind of emotional tonality to the poem or the music, then you pump up certain aspects of the frequencies and vice versa. So it's art at the end, and it's a lot of work.
Talking about poetry and politics, Sudeep, I mean translation and politics, again, as you're saying. So you have already translated Kafi Azmi's poetry, and his poems are basically very direct, political, holding ideas about state, borders, or marginality. And he was also a journalist in the Communist Party newspaper and all. So do you think that poetry has any say or influence in the world or politics of the nation we live in? Even in the level of undoing to a level of language. What do you think?
So politics is all around us. You can't escape politics. I mean, any thinking, feeling human being cannot be apolitical. Now, what you do with that politics, how you use it in your art, is a question of skill. If you use it badly, then it becomes a sloganistic kind of writing. But if you do it well, then you are actually transmitting certain kinds of messages, but very softly. And people are willing to listen to you because you're not in their face. The Kafi Azmi was also a lyric writer, so many of the people know his songs before his poetry. So that helps a lot, so that is a different medium altogether. And then, of course, he was talking about, but politics is very, very important. My poems are very political, but they're very, very couched. As if you read in my work, politics is extremely couched. Because, for instance, take an example of the apartheid poem. Just post-apartheid, you had this sort of protest poetry, for instance, which is very important. And when you hear these poets reading out, standing on a platform, you're moved. You are, it's that visceral feeling. But then you take that poem home and see it on the page, and often it falls flat on the page because there's no structure, there's no, it's meant to be read out aloud. To me, the poems that actually stand the test of time, even a good performance poem should also work on the page and vice versa. That's balance. See, any good poem should be able to be read out beautifully, should be able to be sung, or could be read in the quiet without any assistance. Ideally.
Ideally. So as you mentioned about, sloganistic kind of poetry or, protest poetry. So we have already seen that throughout history, poets have always been at the forefront of welding language to create change in the people. And in the recent times, with the emergence of Black Lives Matter and I Can't Breathe movement, we find so many people expressing their angst through poetry. Why do you think it becomes so necessary, or why do you think people sought after poetry during crisis? I mean, why this? As you said it, you feel it, it hits you.
It's something that you have to reflect yourself. I mean, where does poetry fit into our lives? I think poetry is the most important, essential thing. We can't do without it. Of course, I'm completely biased, but when you think about it, all the important moments in our life, we resort to poetry. Love, death, birth, rituals, marriage. Every significant moment in your life, you actually resort to poetry. Even music is poetry. The dance that's done on the stage is poetry sung aloud. So poetry is all around us, actually. But people think of poetry as something that is textual, which has to be studied, which is hard. If you take poetry as just another living protoplasmic organism that is just as essential as anything else, then this it's completely demystified. You have to take it off the pedestal. And because poetry is so visceral, in times of crises, that's what people resort to. That's what happens. Anytime there's a crisis, you resort to it through poetry, and you see it a lot now. But the thing is, what will remain from the poetries that is being written now is a different question. I should read you, this poem I've just written called, last month, called Obituary. And let me show you this. The New York Times carried the front page when the pandemic started. This is all the people who had died in the first phase. This list of people who died. These are just names with a small headline. And then later also they had another front page which was completely black. And I just thought these two images were just so telling, So I just quote the headline from New York Times. The title of the poem is called Obituary. And I quote, they were not simply names on a list, they were us. Death knells peal, numbers multiply, virus ravages us one by one. No amount of hygiene ritual enables our lungs to resuscitate. Newspaper columns loom unsteady, ghostly apparitions on broadsheet, name, age, date of death, tall epitaphs in fine print. Ink spills, bleeds dark, newsprint blotting out our wheezing breath. Our lives, micro point-size fonts on an ever-inflating pandemic list. Black specks, fugitive lonely numbers, the deceased on an official roster. Another sick, another dying, another dead. Yes, they were us. And part of the structure of the poem takes place from the newspaper columns, this verticality of this, which reminds me at one level of the epitaphs. But there are also the tall buildings in New York and the blackness which sort of goes. So you're playing with lots of different things, but you sort of distill it into something that is almost a plea, a prayer, a hope, a homage to the people.
It takes me to your poem Amistad. I mean, your poems always explore the complex and convoluted mysteries of human mind, and they are consciously cerebral and appeal to a wider section of people who are actually struggling for equality. And when I read Amistad, I actually felt that. I mean, the way you have captured the lives of those people who are actually striving for survival is, I mean, it's very remarkable.
That's the whole history behind that is the black slave trade, which is now coming up. All these things are still not solved.
Not solved. Okay, Sudeep, so now, this may be a good time to ask you about your book, Aerotext, your book of microfiction, prose poems, currently on the shortlist of 2020 Rabindranath Tagore Literary Prize, along with the, there. So, Amitav Ghosh, yes. I do have this book with your autograph on that, but right now I have this one only with me.
This is the Kapiasmi.
Kapiasmi, yes. So yes, so best wishes for that, and how this microfiction, prose microfiction, it also it's called as a kind of experimental kind of book. What kind of experiment we are talking?
I don't know actually. You guys, the copywriters at the publishing house and academics like you can describe it much better. But when I wrote the book, or when I was in the process of writing the book, it took it's been written over many years. I didn't think of which way it's going to fit, but what I realized was when I was looking back at these pieces, they were these short prose poems. Ultimately, they are basically prose poems, but the publishers decided to sell it as fiction. Why? You know that.
Yes.
Because it sells. So the moment it was slotted as a book of fiction, and they had to be truthful, so they had to figure out something. So they call it microfiction. The first who writes microfiction. I like the sound of that. That's all right. But immediately from a poetry book print run, it just quintupled the first print run because it's going to be sold as fiction. So, I mean, these are things I don't really bother about. To me, the form itself was interesting because these are all tiny, tiny, tight pieces. You call it microfiction, flash fiction, prose poems. It really doesn't matter. They are 1 page, half a page, 2 pages, some are few longer than that, but they're really tight. Maybe I should read one just to get a sense of it. And actually, what will happen is I don't know whether you figure out whether it's fiction or poetry. I hope.
That's why it's microfiction.
I read this one because when I look back at it, it's so topical because of what's going on around you. And that is the thing with good writing, hopefully, or meaningful writing. Good, someone else decides. Meaningful writing, that, whichever age you pick it up in, it should have some sort of resonance, regardless. So this one's called Ozone. And in science, ozone is O3. There's that extra molecule. And with all the sort of pandemic and wheezing and nebulizers and ventilators, I just thought, my goodness, it's so relevant again. Ozone. The spray of scented chill pierces my lungs first. Then comes the slow, desperate heaving, the grinding spasms playing, trying to centrifuge stubborn curves of mucus, whose greenish-yellow viscosity remains more deceptive than quicksand's subtle death trap. My face, confined in the transparency of plastic, frosted glass, and thin air, regains for a moment the normalcy of breathing. It is a brief, magical world. The oxygen in my blood is in short supply. I feel each and every electron's charge spurring my senses. Dizzy in aerosol hope, I try to free myself of the medicated mask. But the frozen rain that batters my face reminds me of the tentativeness of living. As I survive on borrowed air, I'm grateful to the equation of science, its man-made safety, its curious balance that adds that precious molecule to create the sanctity of O3, the holy Brahmanical triad, the triumph of its peculiar numeric subscript. My breathing is temporarily back again, electrolyzed, perfectly pitched and nebulized, as narrow, transparent tubes feed dreams into my wide, opaque palate. The sun's edges are dark, so are my hearts. No amount of air will light them up. There you are.
You have to set the tone, yes. So now, Sudeep, coming on to the curation part.
The kinds of people I admire, the kinds of fiction writers I admire are people who write just beautifully. Ultimately, there's nothing more attractive and luring than a beautifully written sentence, a beautifully written chapter. I don't care whether I agree with the protagonist or not. I don't even have a problem if the politics is completely against me. But if it's beautifully written, I'm sold. But imagine, entering a dense book which is unreadable with absolutely fabulous. You're talking about literature and writing. I mean, the writing better be good and it better be grammatically correct.
Okay, so now coming on to the curation part. So you are a curator of World Poetry Prose portfolio series of monosyllables and also a member
and now
of
I do it for this magazine called the Punch magazine that comes out.
The Punch magazine, okay. And you have also represented your poem, Women Desire, Divinity and Denouncement, I want to know, how would you define your own curatorial poetics, or in other words, what critical or creative principle underlie or inform you as a curator, inform your work as a curator?
So when I'm editing anthologies, it's a very simple story. Of course, if I know the poet and I've asked the poet to submit some work, I know whose poetry it is. But otherwise, I would read the poetry blind. I don't know who I'm reading, so I want the text to win. I'm not interested in celebrities or people who are well known or someone is obscure. Text is good enough to shine through, the poem gets into the book. That's how I do my anthologies. I ask my office, my staff to white out the names when it comes, or at least when a printout happens, I only have the poems in front of me, except for the poets I already know are strong and I have asked for them. That's a different thing. But the bulk of it works like that. So it's simple. The text has to win. It's not about friendship. So then and when I sort of finally look at the list, some people have said, "Oh my God, you've got two enemies in that book. How did that happen?" I said, "It doesn't matter. They are good poets." But more often than not in India, is the Sarkari way of doing things is who you know, who should be in, and so on and so forth. I'm completely, uninterested in that. I mean, if I'm doing a book, I've put my name as the editor. Every poem is my baby, and they all are my equal babies, and they all have to win. It's as simple as that. When it comes
Your
to
collection
collaboration,
Rain was also performed in the live concert.
yeah, so Rain is a book of prose poems, microfiction, which is actually eventually part of Erotext. There's a whole section called Downpour. That was a small little book that came out a long time ago.
Mhm.
So this wonderful Moini Attam dancer, Vijay Lakshmi, and her mother, Bharti Shivaji, they transformed this book for a live stage show with music and my poetry. It was mesmeric. I just saw these damsels and angels floating in the stage with fabulous music and lighting. I said, I can't have written this. But that's the beauty, they felt so close to it. The music was done by Mac Quayle, who's one of the top Hollywood music composers, because the dancer partly lives in LA and he's a friend of ours. And at the IIC for their festival, it was performed on stage, and it was just so. To me, it was a gift that was given back to you. I wrote it, someone else transformed it in a different way. Similarly, at the launch of Rain, when it first came out, it was at the British Council, and it was this young band called Advaita, who since then become very well known. And they took 5 of my poems and made them into songs. So I would read the poem and then they would sing it, and it was transformative, what they did. And I told them the only thing that you can't do is destroy my poetry, by which I meant you can't delete lines, you can't repeat the same line as a refrain because you need that in a song. Just do the poem. You be innovative in the way. They did a fabulous job. And then for the reading, it was Tom Alton and me reading, and the stage was just white with white candles, white flowers. I'm a sucker for white things, especially flowers and candles. And so it was beautifully lit, and these guys did the soundscape at the back. It was just magical. And now Erotext, for instance, has just been turned into a stage script by this wonderful, wonderful director and theater person called David Zinder, who is well known in the Jacobian theater drama genre. And he's just made a fabulous stage script. I mean, at some point, let's see if it gets produced. But what he did was, since you've read Erotext, there are all these disparate things in the book, and he's woven them into one story. He's taken, he's made like 7 characters and given them the lines I've written, but the storyline has changed completely because the whole thing takes place over 1.5 hours because it's meant for the stage. So we've called it Erotext Replay. Let's see what happens.
So, Sudipta, talking about the pandemic time, we are very impressed by your poem, Love in the Time of Corona, and especially with the specific insights that you have mentioned in the poem and how you connected the poem at a present time. So, what are your upcoming projects? I mean, or the book in progress? that you want to say
So
apart from?
these the 3 months of lockdown, actually, the only way to keep sane is to keep writing and reading, which is what I'm doing. And actually, I was behind with a lot of projects, so I've been getting a lot of things done. One of the wonderful things that happened was, of course, reorganizing my library. So I took out all the books, and just the joy of discovering letters and old pressed leaves, flower petals, my scribbles. It opened up a whole new world of narrative for me. So, that got me writing. So it's a beautiful space to be in. And I got my library reorganized. It's all alphabetized, country by country, genre by genre. I can find my books now. And in this time, I wrote a lot about what's going on around us. So I have a whole book now, new book ready called Anthropocene. And the subtitle would be Climate Change, Contagion, and Consolation. So the last section is hopeful stuff. And it all started with love in the time of not cholera, corona. Because the editor of the Indian Express newspaper, he asked me to write a piece for the newspaper on the topic. And I'm sure he wasn't expecting, he probably expected a nonfiction piece from an artist's point of view. The last thing he was expecting was I would send him a poem. But I must say he was really bold. He actually published the poem in the newspaper. And he told me this is the first time they published a poem in the newspaper, because since then, the floodgates have opened. Every day he gets poetry. But that did an amazing thing, because it's in the mainstream newspaper on a Sunday. It had a really wide readership. And it spoke to people, because I not only wrote about what was happening, but it was linked with various other things too. The politics and the migrant issue, the social distancing and all that. And then different places all over the world picked it up. It was this magical journey. The poem still is traveling. It's been already translated into Marathi, Bangla, Hindi, Slovenian, French, Spanish, been published in various books. Anthologies are coming out. It's coming there. And this Calcutta filmmaker, Anirban Dotto, has made a short film, a wonderful, wonderful film. We met on Facebook, and then it went from there. And the film hasn't been released. The teaser is doing the rounds, but someone's responded to it with a film. So those are the beautiful gifts that come back to you if you do it honestly, I suspect, in a way.
True. Like while it's hard to see an end in sight in the midst of this darkness, I think our long-term outlook as a nation is hopeful, and we must embrace this pandemic in a way. Thank you so much, Sudeep Da, for giving us hope in this time of pandemic crisis, the lockdown. And I think we can sign off with what you have written, that lives matter in the blackness. There will be light after the darkness.
So I'll tell you the story behind this particular poem. It's a short poem. I'll read it and you can end the program with that. But I'm glad you picked that, actually, because I had picked that as my last poem to read. So at night, it was 2 o'clock at night, and my spouse went to the bathroom. It's a very unglamorous, unsexy story. She went to the bathroom and the light was lit inside the bathroom. So, the side of the door, the light was leaking from there. And I was fast asleep. And then I sort of woke up. That's it. I'm glad. Show that image. Show that image. That's the image. I looked at this extraordinary sheet of darkness with this light streaking out, and it was like this half a crucifix. So I told her, just stay there. I'm going to take some photographs. So those are the sorts of things you have to do if you're like completely mad about poetry. Can you imagine both sleepy people, someone's getting up, setting up the camera, taking a picture, someone's got to be in the loop because I don't want the light to shift. So it was, to me, light leaking, a sort of hope. So this is the poem that came out of it. And I'll end with this, called Hope, Light Leaks. Late at night, light leaks, spilling beyond the door's rectangle edge. A cleaving shift, its shape a partial crucifix, a new resurrection. Lights plane, waxes, wanes, viral load expands, contracts. Lives matter in this blackness. There will be light after the darkness.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sudeepda, for joining me here, and it's really wonderful. I mean, from doing research on your poetry to getting this chance to talk to you, and getting so many things. I mean, I know you say that these are academic things and logic and all that. That doesn't work in poetry, but those who do
No, I
research,
think
I
it's
mean,
important
they
to
know
laugh.
how important it is.
I think it's important to laugh. If you're doing serious work, you have to laugh because otherwise we'll get tied down in all this sort of density. So you have to take yourself, you take yourself seriously, but you have to also have a sense of humor generally. And this is the longest conversation we've had. I mean, you know me through my books, really. So it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.